one of the most overlooked components of RPG games, and one of the greatest tools in our arsenal as GMs is love and sex. So says the great GM, and he should know. These are 5 tips on dealing with love and sex around the table. Are you ready? Let's light up the forge. Oh, sorry. Greetings and salutations. I'm Janet from World Anvil, and today we are talking about love and sex, at least around the table. If you want even more information on these 5 tips, then check out the link in the description to our blog. And make sure you stick around for the challenge at the end so you can put these into practice. Tip number 1, check the sex is right for your campaign setting. So what I mean by this is that you should start by considering your campaign setting and the ramifications of playing within that setting. For example, if you are playing Vampire the Masquerade or Game of Thrones, you're going to expect a lot more grittiness and a lot more adult themes than Tales of Equestria, the My Little Pony RPG. At least I hope so. Dear God, I hope so. So have a think about what's appropriate in terms of romance and sex within your setting. If it's out of genre, an explicit encounter is going to feel really weird and it won't have the impact that you're hoping for. Again, see My Little Pony. You can absolutely have romance in an RPG without sex, and you can have sex without romance. It's really all about genre expectations. Tip number 2 is consent, consent, consent. So we talk a lot on this channel about how not everything is made for everybody. Not every book is made for every reader. Not every campaign is made for every player. This conversation should start in your session 0 as you discuss the campaign and what the players expect and what you expect to make sure that everybody is happy with what's going to happen and everybody has bought into the campaign and is excited to go forwards. If you're thinking about throwing in something that's a little risque, check again closer to the time, but not immediately before, so it's still a surprise, that your players are still happy and they're still comfortable. You might want to have this conversation in private, because a lot of players don't feel comfortable discussing this in public. By the way, that's a good tip that they may not want to play out these scenes around the table as well. Now, there's an important mantra here that is my personal mantra, and that is, consent is paramount, and player agency is sacred. So your players should never be forced into doing something, because that takes away their player agency. That takes away their ability to make decisions. And after all, that's what they're at the table to do. As a GM, I think it's really important that we are on the side of the players and that we should be working towards telling a good story. So you can put them in a difficult situation, but they should always have an out if they want it. And speaking of which, safety tools are wonderful. I highly suggest you check them out. So safety tools are things like X cards. These are cards that players can hold up if they are not comfortable with how things are going, not just for sex and romance, but for anything that might be happening. And they're a wonderful way for players to express that they are uncomfortable without having to explain why. For example, if I'm having a meltdown because the giant spider has just walked into the room and I cannot deal with it, I have a big phobia of spiders, then I can use an X card to say, I am not okay with this, can we remove the spider? The spider instantly becomes something else, there's a little retcon, and everyone around the table is comfortable. I don't have to explain that my horrific fear of spiders comes from the time that a giant tarantula came here in my face when I was doing field work in Italy. No, I can just hold up the X card and we can move on. Really, really useful, and I've linked in the description a great article about safety tools if you want to learn more about them as well. Tip number 3 for handling sex and romance as a GM is that you don't have to roleplay it if you're not comfortable. So, flirty moments around the table can be anything from hilarious to moving to downright uncomfortable. Sure, if your player or your GM is your spouse, then that's one thing. But it can get really awkward around the table if you guys don't know each other very well, or if there's a weird dynamic going on. Don't worry about it. You don't have to roleplay it. That's what the mechanics are for. What I suggest is that you roll the mechanics according to the system. That might be charm, seduce, a will save, or whatever. And then describe what happens in the third person. That gives you a little bit more distance. So she says this, or she does this, or she stands back from the bar and folds her arms, or she gives you her room key, absolutely fine. It's much easier to do that if you're feeling awkward than to inhabit the first person. So that's a little tip on that. By the way that you react as a GM, even out of character, is going to affect the way your players take what's going on as well. If you're trying to do a serious scene and you roll the dice and giggle, it's just going to descend into silliness. So if you are aiming for a more serious flirtation scene or a more serious romance scene, make sure you keep your composure, even if you don't play in first person. Tip number 4 is fade to black. But here's how. So the moment that you fade to black, how far you let things progress before you end the scene, is defined by the amount of adult content in your genre and in your campaign. All campaigns have their own baseline, and you as a GM will know where yours is roughly. It's both the amount of adult content that's in your game and also the amount of player emotional investment. If your campaign is lighthearted and jokey and sort of PG, you might have a few flirty remarks, the door closes, and then you fade. A more adult game might have a few more explicit moments before things disappear into the darkness. This is the moment to watch your players and read the room and make sure everybody is comfortable with what's going on. If the player wants to go further and you feel like other people are getting uncomfortable, you can always ask them to put it in a player journal or to play a solo scene if it's story important. What's even more important than the fade is what happens afterwards. This sort of epilogue or after scene I think is often forgotten, and it's just as important, if not more so, than the before moment. For a light-hearted scene, it may be more witty banter, it may be a few lovelorn looks, and then the player gets on with the campaign. If the encounter is more serious, or if the game is more serious, there may be more serious ramifications to the encounter as well. This epilogue is a chance to explore those and go into them. How does the player character feel? How does the NPC or the other character feel? This is the stuff that makes romance and sex not just a moment at the table, but something that becomes interesting as a character development and a story. And speaking of which, tip number 5 is consequences. Oh yeah. So you're gonna want to check first with your players for some of these, because some of them have major character changing consequences, and you're gonna want to see that they are comfortable with them. But there are so many interesting consequences that you can create from sexual encounters, and they can make great storytelling fodder. I'm sure most of you have considered conditions like STDs or your world's equivalent, and these are a great consequence or ramification of a sexual encounter. But how about more magical consequences and conditions? For example, sure, the PC disappeared off into a brothel, but what if that brothel is run by vampires? Surprise! Now you're a vampire. What do you do next? Another obvious consequence of a sexual encounter is a pregnancy and a child on the way. Again, you may want to discuss this with the player in question. You know your table and you know your players best, so you'll know if that's necessary or not. But this is a wonderful way to develop a character further. If they turn their back on the child, or if they choose to support them, there are so many things that will cause them to change their perspective on the world. Does this galvanize their need to make the world a better place? Does it bring up feelings from their own background, from the fact that they were orphaned, or their own tragic backstory? If your character is religious, particularly if there's somebody divine-powered, like a cleric or a paladin, then have a think about how this might affect their status within their community, the way other people look at them, and also their relationship with their deity. If they've done the naughty with somebody who is out of an opposite faith, has that had any impact? And if they keep doing it, is it going to cause them to lose some of their power? And my favourite consequence is that the person that they had this sexual encounter with was not who they thought. I love this because you can use it in so many interesting ways. They might be a secret agent or a spy. They might even be the big bad themselves. What they thought was a brief sexual encounter was actually somebody rifling through their belongings to try and find more information about their plan. And you can bring this character back later, surprise, and introduce some really interesting dynamics, create really wonderful moments for your table and for your party. Just a little bonus tip, of course, if your player falls in love with an NPC, you can always use them as a quest giver, as somebody who has been abducted. They make absolutely wonderful reasons to go on quests. They make great ways to motivate your party. And in general, playing with those kinds of emotions, very, very useful. So whenever you see a player being drawn to an NPC, that's a great way for you as a GM to start thinking about all the horrible things you can do to that NPC to get your party excited, motivated, active, and emotionally involved with your game. And that, after all, is why we do the thing. It's challenge time! So your challenge, should you choose to accept it, is create a love interest NPC for one of your PCs and add a consequence. You're going to be using the character template on World Anvil for this, and if you click the link in the description, that's where you can submit your prompt and see others as well. Remember to detail why the NPC will be an appropriate love interest for this character, and think about ways you will make them appeal to the character as well. And think about an interesting consequence that will add a new dimension to that player character as well. You'll be using the character template on World Anvil for this, which is absolutely full of prompts to develop characters in more detail. And once you're done, make sure you pull them into the campaign manager, where you can see all your plots and NPCs, roll dice, check out your player character sheets and backgrounds, play music, and everything else that you need as a GM. Let me know what you thought of these 5 tips, guys, and share your own tips for managing romance and sex around the table. I think this is something that we really need to be talking more about. It's such a powerful tool, and I think it really is underused or misused around the table, and there's so much more that we can do as GMs with this to create really amazing campaigns. Please hit that like button if you enjoyed this video or if it made you think, and make sure you're subscribed for more World Anvil tutorials and world building and GMing advice. In the meantime, grab your hammer and go world build.